This program is made possible in part by
Daimler Chrysler Corporation Fund, as part of its commitment to provide information on important contemporary issues to public television viewers nationwide.
And Bank One, offering many investment options to meet your specific financial needs.
President Clinton marked Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday this year by urging Congress to spend $695 million to step up civil rights enforcement and expand the federal hate crimes law to protect homosexuals, women, and the disabled. Welcome to the American Black Journal. I'm Darryl Wood. Does today's civil rights agenda still serve the needs of the African American community? Does the inclusion of homosexuals, women, and the disabled dilute the cause of blacks? Coming up, we'll talk to the Dean of the Congressional Black Caucus, John Conyers, about these issues and others on American Black Journal. Welcome to the program. For more than 35 years, Congressman John Conyers has fought for social justice and economic opportunity. In 1997, he introduced H.R. 40, the Commission to Study Reparations Proposal for African Americans Act. Will America ever pay reparations to the survivors of the African American slave trade? Has the civil rights agenda been diluted? Congressman John Conyers joins me to answer these and other questions. Congressman Conyers, thanks for being on this edition of the Journal.
What a pleasure to be with you again.
Thank you, sir. I want to start off by speculating that our civil rights agenda in the year 2000 is a limited front, if you will. By that I mean, do we really need to continue at this point in our history as African Americans, as full American citizens, continue to speculate on and fight for enforcement of civil rights?
Well, civil rights has been going through a transition, as you suggest, but to me it's moving into the era of human rights, because once you make the separations between de jure and de facto segregation, that is put in place by law and that is by custom and practice, then you begin to move into wider areas. And I think the entire civil rights movement is thinking about the movement that we're making. Now, putting it with the year 2000, the whole country is going through another transition of its own. We're deciding right now whether or not we're going to allow the clock to be turned back on some of the civil rights gains. It's no secret that I viewed two reconstructions in our history. That of after 1865, but that came in 1964 and 1965 with the Civil Rights Act and the Voter Rights Act, which really redefined of necessity. Now we have the Constitution, we have the Bill of Rights, we have all of the amendments, 13, 14, 15, but we still weren't getting there. African Americans, in terms of political progress, voter participation, de facto segregation, we were still surrounded with many challenges that had not been resolved during the era of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
One or many critics have suggested that in that regard, we have reached a point of saturation and we cannot really attack or change what is in the hearts and minds of people throughout these United States who hold institutional power. But what we really need to do at this point in time now is struggle along on the economic front. How does that complement what you're doing, or how does that frustrate what you're doing?
Well, it blends into the whole progress thing, because actually even concentrating on the economic front, we're going to have to deal with the hearts and minds of people. We can't get away from it. And that's what Reverend Jesse Jackson's doing with the Wall Street Project. That's what's going on in terms of many new emphasis in terms of economic development that go beyond the concept of set-asides. But that is a front that is developing as well. Now, at the same time, we're beginning to look at things like the disability, the rights of disabled people, or what about people who are incarcerated and have class action suits that are being cut down? What about people that can't get proper health care because they are in a shunned class, HIV or AIDS? And what we're seeing is that all of these things, including the way we treat people in and out of our prison situation, are human rights questions. The economic rights questions are blossoming too. So the fact that the old standard civil rights struggles are changing, we're moving into a new century, and this thing is evolving. But essentially, we're still working on people's hearts and minds. And I still insist that it starts with government example. It can't start with the private sector. The private sector is subject to SEC and the antitrust rules and the tax rules and fair employment rules and EEOC provisions. And what I'm trying to do in this new century is to move us forward into these new avenues, and you don't have to put a label on it. It's not necessary to qualify.
Some would fear that you don't put a label on it, and that addresses itself to the concept of dilution of the civil rights struggle, or dilution of the black cause, if you will. The struggle that ensued from 1953 forward was seen as a black struggle. Moving forward in time to where we are today, many of the gains that have been made and now are created for other groups like women, gays, imprisoned Americans, and others, certainly not limited to those groups, but many others, the disabled included, would seem to have the net effect, some would argue, of diluting the black struggle. Is the human rights struggle in some way a larger frame of reference that will in effect dilute what has been typically seen as the black struggle?
Yes, and there's no question about that. But the irony of it all is that we find that African Americans are predominant in most of the, and many, if not most, of all of these things that we're developing. Take, for example, the increased incarceration of women. Well, that's going up, but the increased incarceration of African American women is going up higher than the overall increase. When we study about education, we find that without affirmative action programs, they nosedive. But we also find that it also may have some harmful effect on others as well that can be cut out. So what we're saying is that if it's right, it's got to be right, and that we don't need the label as much as we need the progress. And I think that's an important direction. We take the battle in South Carolina over whether we should have the flag that lost standing on the state capitol with the flag that won. We find now that many people realize that this is not just offensive to African Americans. There was a surprising percentage and a huge turnout of non-African American, non-people of color who were there protesting that this flag should come down for reasons that go beyond whether you're black and personally offended by the Confederacy that would have kept us enslaved.
Civil rights agendas are being argued all across the country. The president has chimed in with a plan to spend upwards of $695 million for aggressive enforcement of civil rights legislation and initiatives. That in itself would seem to indicate that while Washington has some commitment to the subject of civil rights and the protection of those rights, again, the concern is that the front on which those monies will be spent will have little effect on the ills that still plague, quote, the black community, unquote. How are you addressing yourself to those concerns?
Well, when we look at where that money will go inside the Department of Justice, it'll be the Civil Rights Division. When you look at the Civil Rights Division, you see that it's broken down to deal specifically with problems that affect African Americans more so than anyone else. And what the President Clinton is trying to correct is something that has been an old tactic that has been used against us for a long time. Merely starve with the resources of the one part of the government that could be doing the job for us. So the Civil Rights Division inside the Department of Justice has been uniquely underfunded, under-resourced for many years. Mm-hmm. And until that comes up, I think we have maybe about less than 24 lawyers fighting EEOC cases across the country, some of which are massive. We have church burnings, which come under the Civil Rights Division. They're still going on, by the way, and we don't have enough lawyers to begin to deal with all of these kinds of questions. We have affirmative action challenges in which in some of the cases, the Department of Justice comes in as either a party or as an amicus. Mm-hmm. And so in these circumstances, we find that the resources are the test. If you don't have the men and women to put on the line, then you can't do the job. And so I think it's a very important theme that is being raised in this campaign. And I'm happy to see that people are racing to get there too. Some of the people who haven't been helpful in the past.
Perhaps a positive development. Perhaps there are many splintered sides to that observation. We'll talk about that and a very important piece of legislation that you're working on right now when we continue this discussion. When the Journal continues, we'll have more with our guest, Congressman John Conyers. Stay with us, and of course, you are watching American Black Journal. Welcome back. My guest is Congressman John Conyers. Before the last break, we were discussing civil rights in general and certain aspects of the civil rights struggle pertaining to black interest in particular. You think it's a good thing that we're moving toward, or that you, as you say, are moving us toward many avenues in what you see now in the year 2000 and beyond as a human rights struggle? You are behind legislation for improved health care in this country. You are behind legislation to enact or amend hate crimes laws in this country. You are behind legislation, most notably and specifically, which is not new but is out there now and creating active dialogue, in particular H.R. 40, to address the issue of reparations for African Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in these United States. Let's take that one in particular for the time being and talk about it just briefly. H.R. 40, where does it stand now, and what kind of substantive, progressive dialogue is it really generating?
The whole concept of reparations always gives my subject matter, H.R. 40, a boost when it's used in a modern context. When, as recently, those in the Holocaust who were forced to work in the plants, the German plants, some automobile plants even, there were reparations that were negotiated out. As a matter of fact, some of our government officials played a very key role, Mr. Eisenstadt, in negotiating this out. And so the whole question of what about the cruelest, longest, most punitive Holocaust of all time, the period of African enslavement in this country. And there we get into a non-dialogue, silence. And what I've tried to do is determine what would be the best strategy to raise this up. In Washington, we debate everything, the furthest reaches of the cosmos, the tiny microbacteria in the water. We hypothesize to and fro all the time.
And some would say that we never seem to get beyond that part of the process, particularly where this issue is concerned. And I just want to invoke the memory of a more recent episode in history to try to put this in some perspective. June 21st, 1921, northeastern Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood Street District.
Yes.
Whites created a riot for 36 to 42 square blocks in that area, destroying what was called Black Wall Street for reasons to this day that are still unannounced to the masses for why it actually happened. The best guess is that the prosperity economically in that district, which was unparalleled in that region at that time, created a kind of animus that brought down this kind of rage on this community. Now, I speculate when I say that, but in addition to that, discussions more recently have taken place as to how shall we redress the people who were adversely impacted. Anywhere from 300 to 1,500 blacks are estimated to have been killed in that race riot. And in addition to that, no economic redress has ever been made. The discussion, as I said again, has now been put forth that some redress could possibly be made to the direct descendants and first generation descendants of that particular siege. However, that's not the same as 150, 250 years of enslavement where we have a trouble addressing who the direct descendants actually are.
Right.
How do you reconcile the difference?
Well, I want to commend you for pulling out that Oklahoma example because in Rosewood, Florida, we were able to deal with that subject. And actually, the Tulsa tragedy is actually one that could be dealt with quite easily were there an inclination to do the right thing. Indian tribes have been subject to numerous reparations. Reparations are mentioned from Kosovo to Israel to Alaska. It's a common diplomatic strategy that has been used from time immemorial in our history. Now, it may require a little more unique application of the theory if there is a debt, if there is a seeking of an apology, if there is an offering of an apology, if there is a desire for atonement, then we may create out of this a different kind of reparations because there have been discussions now held, and I'm so proud that these discussions are now coming forward without any prompting out of universities, out of think tanks, out of writers and creative people just being drawn to the subject matter And what's happening now is that we now have a literature on African reparations for enslavement in America, how it would happen, and why it would happen, and who it would happen to. And this takes me out of the difficult initial task of writing a reparations bill that people could say, well, I support this, or I want this one, or I want that one. We're so beginning in our dialogue, so new in this discussion, that I don't want to give you the Conyers solution to reparations for America. What I do want to give you is the opportunity for us to have an official study and discussion of this for the first time in our history. And if we do that with carefully appointed members of a commission who would not only do their own work, but would conduct hearings around the country for all Americans, so that this is not just an intelligentsia resolution of the problem, but the people with all views would be heard, then we would have the first official body of literature on this in the United States history.
How can we get beyond, that is, we, those who advocate historic reparations, that is, reparations for enslaved Africans in America, how do we get beyond the congressional gridlock? Because if we're building a foundation of intelligentsia, literature, and support nationwide, the battle must still be won in the Congress.
Exactly.
Where and how do we break the gridlock?
Well, the same way we broke the gridlock with the Martin Luther King bill that I introduced, when people would say, I'll join your bill, John, but I know you can't get it passed, but I'm going to join it anyway. Now, in the case of Dr. King, I didn't have to make an argument for his greatness, his contribution, his brilliance, his courage, his contribution to the nation and to the world and to his people. Now, here in reparations, it's a little further back. It's one step removed, at least. And so here the case has to be made. And it is true, you're right. This has to go through Congress because it's going to be legislation that will have some appropriation, some a budget requirement attached to it. And therefore, we have to treat it like we did civil rights legislation, the right to vote, and everything else that ultimately becomes law. If there was some way to get around it, I'd be the first to do it.
Too bad you don't have the power to write an executive order.
Well, even an executive order would be very helpful, and we've gotten pretty close to that. I mean, I was in the White House when the president signed the order for the Tuskegee, the ignoble Tuskegee experiment, and which he brought all of those. There were some survivors and the family, and there wasn't a dry eye in the White House when they figured out how to do that.
Again, the chief difference being that these were people who were there. These are people who have direct descendants right in line beneath them. And so we can see their contribution, and we can see the effect of reparations or an acknowledgement or an apology. We are a long way from that on the issue of reparations for enslaved Africans, and I wish we had time to discuss the strategies, but we have to leave it here for now, Congressman Conyers, and I thank you for being here.
Well, you've raised the single issue that we need to be working on, and I think that can be dealt with too. I'm confident of it.
Thanks again for being here on this edition of the American Black Journal.
Always pleased to join you.
That's all for this week. If you'd like more information on the subjects discussed during this program, send us email at abj@wtbs.pbs.org or call the viewer hotline at 313-876-8394. And of course, you are watching American Black Journal.
This program is made possible in part by
Daimler Chrysler Corporation Fund, as part of its commitment to provide information on important contemporary issues to public television viewers nationwide.
And Bank One, offering many investment options to meet your specific financial needs.